Thank you, Pete. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the systemic, I'm going to talk about China and the US, about the systemic drivers of these systems and the kind of built-in barriers to mitigating CO2 emissions. Obviously, the environmental issue, there are many more environmental issues, but for this purpose, we're just going to talk about CO2 emissions. So I'm going to talk about the US and China. I contend that these are, that for all the market reforms in China, it's the last 4 decades, it's still very much not a capitalist economy. It's a hybrid economy. It's hybrid in a double sense. It's a kind of a what I call a bureaucratic collectivist capitalist economy. That it's a state-owned, it's like, or bureaucratic collectivist considered Stalinist. Just say it's Stalinist economy with a police state government and so forth. But it's a hybrid economy. It's got both a capitalist sector and a state sector. The state sector is about half the economy. The foreign invested special economic zones on the coast, like Shenzhen and so forth, that's about 30% of the economy. And the rest is privately owned. For those who are more interested in that issue, I wrote an article in Spectre last year on called China Isn't Capitalist Despite the Pink Ferraris. It was a response to another article in that journal. And so anyway, so as a state economy with a private sector, the state-owned industries obey two bosses. They're both, they have state plans that they're mandated to produce for, and they also have, since Deng Xiaoping cut a profit-sharing deal with the state-owned industries back in the 1980s, they're also free to sell overplan output on the side and also produce sideline production for the free market. So to this extent, they're profit maximizers. So the Chinese economy is hybrid in both of those sense. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit first about capitalism in the West, about the US and capitalism. What are the drivers of CO2 emissions and what are the built-in limits? Well, given the imperative to maximize profits to date, all approaches to mitigation, to emissions mitigation, voluntary cuts, cap and trade schemes, and so on have foundered on the contradiction between the need to prioritize growth over emissions suppression. Climate change will kill us in the long run, but shutting down companies, collapsing the economy to suppress emissions will kill us in the short run. 5 of the 10 top Fortune 500 companies are oil companies and 2 are auto companies. So to avoid shutting down companies, governments have adopted market-friendly approaches like carbon trade and cap and trade and so forth. And these have failed to dent emissions and just kick the can down the road. So in capitalism, the prime mover is profit maximization and growth. So in my book, Green Capitalism, The God That Failed, and a bunch of articles, I've argued that the only way to slam the brakes on CO2 emissions in capitalism is to shut down or drastically retrench fossil fuel-based industries and fossil fuel-dependent industries that cost the economy, not just the oil producers, but oil and gas, the oil and gas companies, but the downstream industries like autos and cement and steel and construction and chemicals and synthetics and so on and so forth. There's just no alternative to this need for economic contraction in order to suppress emissions in the short time frame we had available. If we had done something 20 years ago and begun to cut emissions, maybe we wouldn't have to do this. But now we face a very short time frame, and so we really don't have much choice but to slam the brakes on economic growth and actually retrench our industrial economies. I laid out what I thought in a paper called An EcoSocialist Path to Limiting Temperature Rise to 1.5 degrees C. I wrote which I wrote as a background paper for the DSA. I think Pete may have passed this on to you, or at least it's in a packet there for you. I sketched out what I think is a plausible 4-point emergency plan for suppressing emissions without crashing the economy. And it also meshes well with AOC's Green New Deal, her call for decarbonization in her Green New Deal plan that she proposed as a bill for the Congress in 2018, early 2019. So the 4 points are to nationalize fossil fuel companies, producers, and downstream industries with buyouts, if necessary, to phase out fossil fuels. Secondly, creating a WPA-type workers' employment job program to guarantee reemployment for redundant fossil fuel workers with comparable pay and benefits. Thirdly, launching an emergency system-wide transition to renewable energy. And fourthly, downsizing the US industrial economy by abolishing all kinds of disposable products and retrenching superfluous and harmful industries. I discuss these in detail in the papers. I won't bother with it right now, but feel free to raise it and we can discuss it. I sort of saw this process as beginning within the framework of capitalism. This is not a revolutionary overthrow here, but beginning within the framework of capitalism, because they're not in a position to overthrow it. But through the effort to decarbonize the economy, this would inevitably require nationalization of fossil fuel companies by one means or another. And this process would lead, I think, to increasingly radical demands for popular control over the economy, tending in the direction of eco-socialism. The specifics of this model that I sketched out are geared to the US and obviously wouldn't be applicable to countries where fossil fuels either are absent or already nationalized. And of course, the deindustrialization in the industrialized global north needs to be balanced by sustainable, albeit non-capitalist industrialization in the south, because millions of people don't even have electricity. But the idea of asserting popular power to prioritize people and planet over growth and profit, and of downsizing the over-industrialized economies of the North is, I think, widely applicable. By deindustrialization, I'm not talking about completely, I'm not talking about going back to log cabins here. It's just that there are many, many industries that we really don't need. Like the auto industry, for example, is built on repetitive consumption of essentially a disposable product instead of making something that'll last forever. iPhones, for example, there's no bloody reason why an iPhone made 10 years ago could not be perfectly suitable and used and rebuildable and upgradable today, but that wouldn't fit with Apple's profit plans. So to stay in business, they have to convince you to buy a new one every year or two, and that cost, the ecological cost of iPhones is pretty high. So the same across the economy. So it's not that we need to live without mobile phones, for example, but we need to make them durable and long-lasting and recyclable and rebuildable and upgradable, and the same with everything else we make. And we need to share things instead of hogging them. So that's the central idea there. Okay, so obviously this raises questions which we can talk about. Then to turn to China, China is different. Its drivers are different. Its built-in barriers are different from normal capitalism. And here I'm focusing mostly on the state sector as opposed to the private sector, because it's most of the economy and it overdetermines all the rest. So while it's often reported that China's CO2 emissions lead the world, few appreciate the scale of those emissions, how disproportionate they are compared to other large emitters, how fast they're growing, and the difficulty and possibility really of reining them in so long as the Communist Party remains in power. In 1990, China's CO2 emissions were just half those of the United States. In the 15 years from 1990 to 2005, they more than doubled. Then in the next 12 years, from 2006 to 2016, they doubled again to nearly twice those of the US, although China's GDP was just 63% as large as the US in 2017. In 2018, China's CO2 emissions were nearly as much as the next 5 largest emitters, the US, India, Russia, Japan, and Germany combined. Yet China's GDP was just 32% as large as those combined GDPs. And unlike elsewhere, China's numbers are trending up, not down. While China's emissions have been growing about 4 or 5% a year, emissions in the EU, the US, and Japan have been trending downward. To be sure, those declines are far from sufficient to reduce global warming, and they're not even enough to meet the US, EU, and Japan's commitments to the 2015 Paris Agreement. But at least they're declines. By contrast, China's carbon emissions have quadrupled between 1990 and 2017. As the world's largest emitter, accounting for 30% of total global emissions, against 15% for the US, 9% for the EU 28, 7% for India, 5% for Russia, and 4% for Japan. China is by far the leading driver of global warming and thus the leading environmental threat to life on Earth. And this is really a huge matter. Okay, China presents a climate crisis paradox. It's the largest producer of photovoltaic panels and wind turbines. It's invested more in those than all the rest of the world combined. It leads the world in installed capacity of both, accounting for about 30% of the global total in 2018. President Xi Jinping has stated that he wants to lead the fight against global warming. In 2017, when Trump announced that the US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, Xi termed that a hard-won achievement that all signatories must stick to. Walking away from the pact would endanger future generations, he said. Yeah, that's exactly what he's done. As China's economy has rebounded from the coronavirus, industrial pollution has surged. Instead of prioritizing clean energy, Xi's government has been slashing funding for wind and solar power while ramping up spending on new coal-fired power plants. For all of China's investments in renewables to date, solar and wind produced barely 8% of the country's electric generation in 2018 and 19, versus 9% in the US, and with less than a third as much investment, while coal accounts for 70%. Last year, it fell very slightly to 69%. At this rate, it'll take till the end of the century before coal is phased out. Similarly, instead of reducing reliance on heavily polluting intensive industries and transitioning to the path of low carbon development that Xi promised to do at the UN talk in September 2020, Xi's government is pouring investments into yet more unneeded industries and infrastructure. More steel, aluminum, plate glass, cars, and dozens of other commodities that are already in oversupply. More unneeded high-speed trains that run near empty, more use of subway systems built in small towns, more empty airports, more empty expressways and bridges to nowhere, more empty ghost cities, even as the population is set to decline, actually may already be declining. More bling infrastructure vanity projects to the glory of the Communist Party, like the world's largest radio telescope, and the second largest dams, and the most skyscrapers, and the longest bridges, and the fastest trains, and maglev trains, and so on. All these are vanity projects for the CCP above all. How do we explain these tendencies and contradictions? Well, I argue that China's bureaucratic economy is driven by three imperatives that are at least as powerful, if not more powerful, than the profit motivation imperative of capitalism. And these three are: first, that they need to maximize growth and self-sufficient industrialization. As a state-based ruling class and a communist nation in a world dominated by advanced, powerful capitalist nations, Mao and his successors like Stalin, Khrushchev, and Gorbachev in the USSR have understood that they must catch up and overtake the US, build themselves a relatively self-sufficient high-tech superpower economy shielded from Western takeover. That's their only guarantee that they won't be taken over by the West again. The Soviets' failure to win the economic and arms race with the United States doomed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Deng Xiaoping and his successors, notably Xi Jinping, have been determined to avoid that error. So that's the major driver of China's growth. Second, they must maximize employment. In capitalism, employers don't care about the unemployed. It's not their problem. If workers are laid off, it's not the capitalist problem. But because the Communist Party was indeed once a workers' party, and because the party derives its legitimacy from its claim to represent the working class, it can't completely ignore workers. And it's better to have them producing something than just milling about causing trouble. That's why 5-year plans regularly include job creation targets. In November 2013, Prime Minister Li Keqiang underscored this imperative, stating that employment is the biggest thing for well-being. The government must not slacken on this for one moment. For us, stable growth is mainly for the sake of maintaining employment. So the problem is that keeping China's hundreds of millions of workers working often means keeping them producing superfluous steel, needless infrastructure, ghost cities, and so on. Maximizing employment is a major driver of overconstruction, overproduction, blind growth, blind investment, and profligate waste of energy across the economy. Thirdly, they need to maximize consumption and consumerism. In the wake of the collapse of the Communist Party in 1991 and the Chinese Communists' own near-death experience with the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, the party resolved to create a mass consumer society and raise incomes in order to focus people's attention on consumption and take their minds off politics. That's why 5-year plans include new consumer industries, and the government has promoted one consumer craze after another: the car craze, the condo craze, shopping mall craze, tourism, golf course craze, theme park craze, and so on and so forth. No doubt, after centuries of privation and Maoist austerity, China's masses were overdue for some creature comforts. It was about time. But promotion of mindless consumerism for the sake of consumerism these days, like with Alibaba's single-day sales marathons and so forth, like Black Friday here in the US on the model of Western capitalism, is contributing mightily to China's and the world's waste and pollution crises. Less enviable among Chinese many first is this headline from the China Daily: China #1 dumper of plastic into ocean. The problem with all this hypergrowth is that to maximize economic growth, employment, and consumerism, China's leaders have no choice but to overconsume resources and let the polluters pollute. There's just no way around that. Then there are the built-in, the systemic barriers to mitigation and abatement in this system. And these are three. First, given the party's dictatorship, there are no independent regulators, no courts, no independent regulators or courts or police. These are all controlled by the party. And China has an EPA equivalent, Environmental Protection Agency equivalent. It has an FDA equivalent. It has very good environmental laws on the books, but they're not generally enforced. Regulators are powerless. They have no authority to shut down state industries. They're subordinate to and often paid by the very industries they're supposed to regulate. And of course, since it's a police state, people, ordinary citizens have no way to change its policies. I sent Pete an article from Bloomberg about how children are taught about climate change in China. This is from a few days ago. It's a very interesting article. You might have heard also about the state shutdown of the social media app Clubhouse on Monday. Clubhouse is a hugely popular app that let Chinese in China talk freely with Chinese all over the world. She didn't like that, so he closed that down Monday. Okay, that's the first issue: the lack of independent regulation or police and so forth. The second is that the state can't systematically enforce its own anti-pollution regulations, especially against state-owned industries, the largest polluters. And this I find is ironic because, you can read in the West, you read in The Economist or the Wall Street Journal, they're always telling us how China's dictatorship ought to be an advantage, the advantage of authoritarianism. As head of the most powerful police state in history, Xi ought to be able to compel his own subordinate officials to stop polluting and ram through his transition to renewable energy. So why doesn't he do it? And the reason is that those officials actually are not employees like capitalism. They're members of the same political party as Xi Jinping. And so they can't be systematically fired like regular capitalist employees. In a system where there is no rule of law. Everyone's survival depends on their connection, on their relationships. What the Chinese call guanxi, which is those relationships with patrons above and supporters below. If you've got good guanxi, you can keep your polluting enterprise going, keep making profits for your local economy and maintaining jobs. Lastly, for all his green talk, Xi Jinping cannot enforce his own pollution regulations because his overriding priority is not to build an ecological civilization, but to turn China into the world's leading superpower. So for that, he needs those coal-fired power plants, the chemical companies, the cement producers, the auto factories, the aircraft carriers, and so on and so forth. And I sent Pete an article I published a little bit ago about Xi Jinping's pledge to make China carbon neutral by 2060. So people might look at that. But the first half of that article dealing with all these specifics about the particular hard to abate industries like steel and aluminum and cement and many others, those apply, the difficulties of abating those industries apply as much to the United States or Europe as to China. But I'm just pointing that out because the Chinese could, in principle, convert, even if they converted all of their energy production, their electricity production to wind and solar, that's still, they only account for about 36% of China's emissions. The rest are from many other sources, but the bulk of them, about 50%, are from these hard to abate industries, which are going to be hard to abate the world over. Another reason why I think in the short run, the only solution for those industries is to retrench them, is close many of them down and retrench many others. I mean, you just really can't clean up the pollution from them in any near-term time frame that matters for survival. So what can be done? Well, the only way in my book, I argued that the only way China can suppress the country's emissions is to shut down and or drastically retrench most of the industries they built since the 1990s: coal, oil, cement, construction, auto, shipping, aviation, rails, chemicals, plastics, disposables, and others. But of course, needless to say, the Communist Party is not going to do any of that because its survival depends on maximizing growth and winning superpower prestige to the glory of the CCP. Yet Xi's boom till we bust program is, I believe, doomed one way or another. In October 2019, climate scientists published research showing that on present trends, global warming is going to all but erase Shanghai, Shenzhen, and most of the world's great coastal cities, including New York and London, by 2050. There won't be any great rejuvenation or glory for the Communist Party when Shanghai and Shenzhen are underwater, when China's glaciers melt and the rivers dry up and farming collapses. It's going to be collapse. So there are no jobs and no profits on a dead planet. You can't sustain endlessly growing economies on a finite planet. That's a recipe for collective human suicide. The question is, will the Chinese and will we in the West rise up and destroy these systems before they destroy us all? I'm trying to be optimistic, and I'm betting that capitalism and Stalinism will collapse before the climate collapses, but we do need to hurry. We need to be out there agitating and mobilizing. I'll stop here. Thank you for your patience.